The gentle hum of downtown Chicago traffic filled Joe Thompson's Tesla Model 3 as he navigated through the morning rush hour. His coffee, a Vinnie Pike Place from the corner Starbucks, sat cooling in the cup holder. The spring sun painted golden streaks across Lake Michigan, visible through the gaps between skyscrapers. Joe adjusted his Rolex, a gift from his firm for being top seller last quarter, and smiled at the thought of another promising day ahead. At 35, he had everything he'd ever dreamed of growing up in suburban Milwaukee. A corner office at premier Chicago real estate, a gorgeous brownstone in Lincoln Park, and Sarah, his wife of 7 years, who still made his heart skip a beat every time she smiled. The Ring doorbell notification chirped through his car speakers, interrupting his favorite morning podcast about real estate investment strategies. He glanced at the dashboard display, expecting to see Mrs. Martinez, their cleaning lady, arriving for her weekly visit. Instead, his blood ran cold. There was Sarah, his Sarah, fumbling with her keys at their front door. It was 11:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. She should have been at Chase Bank, where she worked as a senior customer service manager. But that wasn't what made his hands grow clammy on the steering wheel. It was the man standing behind her, his hand resting intimately on the small of her back. Joe pulled over into a Walgreens parking lot, his breakfast bagel threatening to make a reappearance. The man was tall, dressed in what looked like a custom Tom Ford suit. His salt and pepper hair was expertly styled, his confidence evident in every movement. Sarah was laughing at something he said, her head thrown back in a way Joe hadn't seen in months. They disappeared inside, the door closing behind them with a final-looking click. Joe sat there, his mind refusing to process what he'd just witnessed. Sarah had been coming home late recently, blaming it on staff shortages at the bank. She'd been more distant, always on her phone, but Joe had attributed it to work stress. What a fool he'd been. He pulled up the Ring app on his phone, scrolling through previous recordings with trembling fingers. There they were again, 2 days ago, sharing a lingering kiss on the doorstep. A week before that, arriving together in a sleek black Range Rover. The evidence stretched back nearly 2 months. Joe's vision blurred as tears threatened to spill over. He checked his watch, 11:45 a.m. His next showing wasn't until 3 p.m., a luxury condo in the West Loop. Plenty of time to go home and catch them in the act. But something held him back. Mike's voice echoed in his head, advice from a buddy's similar situation last year. Document everything, bro, don't let emotions screw you over. Instead of racing home, Joe drove to his office, grateful for the privacy of his corner space with its view of the Chicago River. He downloaded all the Ring footage to his laptop, organizing it meticulously by date and time. His secretary, Linda, knocked once before poking her head in. "Joe, your 1:30 canceled. Are you feeling okay? You look a little pale." He forced a smile that felt like it might crack his face. "Just fighting a migraine, Linda. Thanks for letting me know." She nodded sympathetically and closed the door quietly behind her. Joe's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Working late tonight, babe. Don't wait up for dinner. Love you." The casual lie made his stomach turn. He opened his bottom desk drawer and pulled out the bottle of Jack Daniels he kept for celebrating big sales. Today, it would serve a different purpose. The whiskey burned going down, but it didn't help. Nothing could numb the image of that stranger's hands on his wife. By 5 p.m., Joe had a plan. He stopped at Whole Foods on the way home, filling his cart with Sarah's favorites. Chilean sea bass, organic asparagus, that fancy French wine she loved. He'd create the perfect setting for her confession. The house was empty when he arrived, everything in its place as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The couch where they'd spent countless evenings watching Netflix now seemed tainted. Had they been there too? Joe pushed the thought away and focused on cooking. He set the table with their wedding china, the delicate pattern of silver leaves catching the light from the dimmed chandelier. Sarah's key turned in the lock, at 8:45 p.m. Joe, what's all this? She stood in the dining room doorway, looking beautiful and uncertain in her navy business suit. Her perfume, Chanel No. 5, mixed with another scent Joe didn't recognize. Thought we could use a nice dinner together, he said, pulling out her chair. It's been a while. Sarah's smile faltered slightly as she sat down. This is lovely, but you didn't have to go to all this trouble. Joe poured the wine, watching the deep red liquid swirl in her glass. How was work? Must have been busy today. Sarah took a sip of wine, her hand steady. Oh, the usual. That staff shortage is really killing us. Joe nodded, cutting into his perfectly cooked fish. Interesting. I got a ring notification today. The fork paused halfway to Sarah's mouth. Oh, yeah, around 11:30. Caught an interesting video. The color drained from Sarah's face. Joe, who is he, Sarah? His voice was quiet, controlled, masking the chaos inside. Sarah set down her fork, her hands now visibly shaking. His name is Mark. Mark who? Mark Peterson. He's a client at the bank. Joe took another sip of wine, letting the silence stretch between them. How long? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. 2 months. Maybe 3. Do you love him? The question hung in the air like poison gas. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know anything anymore. Joe stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Well, that makes 2 of us. He walked to their bedroom, pulled a duffel bag from the closet, and started packing. Sarah followed him, crying now. Joe, please. We can talk about this. We can fix it. He turned to face her, and the sight of her tears no longer moved him. Fix it? How many times did you bring him to our home, Sarah? She flinched at his tone. How many times did you lie to me about working late? I'm sorry, she sobbed. I never meant for this to happen. Joe zipped up his bag and brushed past her. I'll be at Mike's. Don't call me. Joe, wait. There's more you need to know. He paused at the front door, not turning around. There are things about my past, things I never told you. Save it for the divorce lawyers, he said, and walked out into the Chicago night. The drive to Mike's place in Wicker Park was a blur. Joe's phone kept buzzing with texts and calls from Sarah, but he ignored them all. Mike answered the door in basketball shorts and a Bulls t-shirt, took one look at Joe's face, and wordlessly went to the fridge for beers. Want to talk about it? Joe took a long pull from his bottle. Sarah's been cheating on me. Mike's face darkened. Shit, man. I am sorry. Got it all on the Ring camera. At least you've got proof. My cousin Tony had to hire a PI when his wife stepped out. Joe sank into Mike's worn leather couch, suddenly exhausted. I thought we were happy, Mike sat down next to him. Sometimes people just show you who they really are. Yeah, well, I wish she'd shown me before I spent 7 years of my life with her. Mike's basement apartment was small but comfortable, with a spare room he used for gaming. Stay as long as you need. Bromi casa yes su casa. Joe managed a weak smile. Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate it. That night, lying on the fold-out couch, Joe scrolled through his phone. Sarah had finally stopped calling, but she'd sent one last text. There's so much you don't know about me. Please let me explain. He turned off his phone and stared at the ceiling, wondering what else his wife had been hiding. Sleep didn't come until the first hints of dawn began to color the sky. When it did, his dreams were filled with strangers in expensive suits, laughing at him from his own doorstep. Morning came too soon, streaming through Mike's basement windows. Joe's head throbbed from too much beer and too little sleep. His phone showed 15 missed calls from Sarah and one from Linda at the office. He texted Linda that he'd be working remotely today. Coffee's ready, Mike called from the kitchenette. And I ordered breakfast burritos from Big Star. Joe dragged himself to the kitchen, gratefully accepting the steaming mug. I need to find out who this guy is, he said between sips. Mike pulled out his laptop, What's his name again? Mark Peterson. The Google search results painted an impressive picture. Mark Peterson, CEO of Next Tech Solutions, a rising star in Chicago's tech scene. Forbes had featured him in their 40 Under 40 list 2 years ago. His company had just secured Series C funding for $150 million. There were photos of him at charity galas, startup conferences, and Cubs games. In every shot, he radiated confidence and success. Well, now we know why Sarah fell for him, Mike muttered. Joe ignored the comment, clicking through to Mark's Instagram. The man lived like a movie star. Private jet trips to Aspen, yacht parties in Miami, front row seats at Hamilton. And there, in a group photo from 3 months ago, Joe spotted Sarah. She was in the background at some charity event, smiling up at Mark. The caption read, "Great turnout at the Children's Hospital fundraiser. Hashtag giving back, hashtag Chicago cares." Joe's hands clenched into fists. I need to confront this guy. Mike looked concerned. You sure that's a good idea? I need answers, Mike. A quick search revealed that Mark frequented Intelligentsia Coffee in the West Loop. Several recent Instagram posts showed the same distinctive blue coffee cup. Joe showered, borrowed a clean shirt from Mike, and headed out. The morning rush at Intelligentsia was just winding down when he arrived. And there was Mark, holding court at a corner table with 2 young tech brothers in matching Patagonia vests. Joe ordered a coffee and waited. The tech brothers eventually left, and Mark sat alone with his laptop. Joe approached the table, his heart pounding. Mark Peterson? Mark looked up, his expression professionally neutral. Yes? Can I help you? I'm Joe Thompson, Sarah's husband. The flicker of recognition in Mark's eyes confirmed everything. I wondered when this would happen. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. Please sit. Joe remained standing. Why my wife? Mark closed his laptop, looking oddly sympathetic. It wasn't planned, if that's what you're asking. Did she tell you she was married? Of course. She told me everything. Something in his tone made Joe pause. What do you mean, everything? Mark leaned back, studying Joe carefully. How much do you actually know about your wife's past, Joe? The question hit like a punch to the gut. We met in Chicago. She moved here from Seattle for a fresh start. Mark's laugh was soft and without humor. A fresh start. That's one way to put it. What's that supposed to mean? It's not my story to tell. Ask her about Portland. About a man named Greg. Joe's coffee sat untouched, growing cold. If you know something, tell me. Mark shook his head. Sarah needs to tell you herself. But let me give you some advice. Be careful how hard you pull on this thread. He stood up, gathering his things. For what it's worth, I'm sorry about the affair. It was wrong of both of us. Joe watched him walk away, more confused than ever. Back in Mike's car, he sat staring at his phone. Portland. Greg. The pieces of a puzzle he never knew access. Ted. He called Linda at the office. Linda, remember that background check service we use for high-end clients? Sure, Joe. Need me to run someone? Yeah. Sarah Thompson, but go back at least 10 years. And check Portland, Oregon. Linda's pause was barely noticeable. You're Sarah? Please, Linda. And keep this between us. Of course. I'll have it for you tomorrow. Joe spent the rest of the day in a daze. Mike ordered deep dish from Lou Malnati's for dinner, but Joe could barely eat. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was Mark. Think about what you really want to know. Some doors can't be unclosed. Joe deleted the message. That night, he dreamed of Sarah in Portland, surrounded by strangers with shadowy faces. Morning brought Linda's email. The background check was thorough, but the results were puzzling. There was no record of Sarah living in Portland. In fact, there was very little record of her anywhere before Chicago. It was as if she'd appeared out of thin air 7 years ago. Joe forwarded the report to Mike. This is weird, right? Mike's response came quickly. Very weird. Time to call in the pros. Joe knew a guy who knew a guy. By noon, he was sitting in a dimly lit office above a boxing gym in Ukrainian village. Frank DeLuca had been a private investigator for 20 years. His desk held 2 computer monitors and a Cubs bobblehead. So, you wanted to look into your wife's past? Joe nodded, sliding across a manila envelope with photos and information. Focus on Portland, Oregon. Around 2015 or earlier. Frank's fee was steep, but Joe didn't care. I'll need a few days, Frank said. I've got contacts in Portland. Joe left his card, trying not to look as desperate as he felt. Back at Mike's, he finally listened to one of Sarah's voicemails. Joe, please. We need to talk. There are things you need to understand. He deleted it and poured himself a drink. 3 days passed in a fog of work and waiting. Joe threw himself into his real estate listings, avoiding the house and Sarah's calls. On Friday morning, Frank called. You're going to want to come down here. The boxing gym was closed, the street quiet. Frank's office felt smaller in the daylight. I found something interesting in Portland. He pulled up a mugshot on his computer. Joe's heart stopped. The woman in the photo was definitely Sarah, but with dark hair and a harder look in her eyes. The name on the booking sheet read Rachel Mitchell. Arrested for drug possession and theft in 2014, Frank said. She was running with a crew led by this man. Another mugshot appeared. A man with tattoos and cold eyes. Greg Kovac, small-time dealer who graduated to bigger things. Joe felt the room spin slightly. Sarah was his girlfriend? Frank nodded. And his partner in various illegal activities. What happened? Greg got busted in a major sting. Rachel Mitchell disappeared. Frank pulled up a newspaper article. 3 months later, Sarah Thompson appeared in Chicago with a clean record and a job at Chase Bank. Joe stared at the mugshot, his world tilting on its axis. She changed her identity? Looks that way, and did a pretty good job of it too. Joe thought about their first date, her reluctance to talk about her past, the way she avoided having her picture taken. It all made horrible sense now. Is Greg still in prison? Frank shook his head. Released last year. Dropped off the radar after that. Joe felt a chill run down his spine. Does he know where she is? That's the thing, Frank said, looking uncomfortable. Someone's been accessing Sarah's HR records at Chase. When? Last week. Remote access, but the IP address traces back to Portland. Joe stood up, so quickly his chair fell over. I need to warn her. Frank caught his arm. Wait, there's more. He pulled up one final document. Greg Kovac was found dead in his Portland apartment 3 days ago. Joe sank back into his chair. Apparent overdose, but the police are treating it as suspicious. The implications hit Joe like a freight train. You think Sarah, Rachel, whoever she is? Frank held up his hands. I'm just showing you what I found. Joe wrote a check with a shaking hand. Outside, the Chicago spring had turned cold and gray. He sat in his car, trying to make sense of everything. His wife wasn't just an unfaithful partner. She was a completely different person. A criminal. Maybe worse. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. We need to talk. Please come home. It's important. Joe started the car. It was time to hear the whole truth, even if it destroyed what little was left of his world. The drive home felt like entering enemy territory. Each familiar street now seemed strange and threatening. Joe parked in front of their brownstone, noticing Sarah's Audi in the driveway. The porch light was on, waiting for him. Sarah opened the door before he could use his key. She looked smaller somehow, wrapped in an oversized Northwestern sweatshirt. Her eyes were red from crying. You found out about Portland, she said. It wasn't a question. Joe followed her into the living room, keeping his distance. Rachel Mitchell, he said, watching her flinch at the name. Were you ever going to tell me? Sarah sank onto the couch, pulling her knees to her chest. I wanted to, so many times. But you didn't. How could I? Hey, honey, by the way, I used to be a drug dealer's girlfriend. Joe remained standing, his back against the wall. Greg's dead. Sarah's face went pale. What? Found in his apartment 3 days ago. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling over. Oh God. Oh God, no. Did you have anything to do with it? The question hung in the air like smoke. No, I haven't seen Greg since I left Portland. Someone accessed your HR files at Chase. From Portland. Sarah still. D up, pacing nervously. He found me. Last month. Started sending messages through LinkedIn. What did he want? Money. He said he'd expose everything if I didn't pay. The pieces started falling into place. Is that why you started seeing Mark? For his money? Sarah laughed bitterly. Mark was, God, I don't even know. An escape? A distraction? She turned to face Joe, her eyes pleading. I was scared. Greg's messages got more threatening. I felt trapped. So, you decided to cheat on me instead of telling me the truth? I couldn't drag you into this mess. I was already in it. Joe shouted, making her jump. I married you. I built a life with you. The doorbell rang, startling them both. Through the front window, Joe saw two figures in dark suits. Sarah went white as a sheet. Police. Chicago PD. Came a voice from outside. Joe opened the door. Two detectives showed their badges. Mrs. Sarah Thompson? We need to ask you some questions about Gregory Kovac. The next few hours were a blur of questions and revelations. The detectives set up in their dining room, the same room where Joe had confronted Sarah about Mark. Detective Rodriguez took the lead, her voice professional but kind. Mr. Kovac's death has been ruled a homicide. Sarah gripped the edge of the table. We found substantial transfers from your account to his over the past month. He was blackmailing me, Sarah whispered. She told them everything. About her life as Rachel Mitchell. About meeting Greg in Portland. About the drugs, the theft, the gradual descent into a life she never wanted. I didn't kill him, she insisted. I was trying to buy his silence. Detective Chun, the younger of the two, typed everything into his laptop. Can you account for your whereabouts 3 days ago? Sarah looked at Joe, her eyes desperate. She was with Mark Peterson, Joe said quietly. At our house. I have security footage. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The detectives left around midnight, taking Sarah's passport. She wasn't under arrest, but she couldn't leave Chicago. Joe stood in the kitchen, making coffee neither of them would drink. What happens now? Sarah asked. I don't know. Are you going to divorce me? Joe stared into his coffee cup. I don't even know who you are. The next few weeks passed in a surreal haze. Sarah moved in with a friend from work. The police investigation continued. Joe threw himself into a punishing new routine. Up at dawn for runs along Lake Michigan. Long hours at the office. Weekends exploring hiking trails in the nearby forest preserves. Mike dragged him to a therapist, Dr. Jennifer Chun. Her office overlooked Millennium Park. You're dealing with multiple traumas, she said during their first session. The affair, the revelations about Sarah's past, the ongoing investigation. Joe watched the tourists below, taking selfies with the bean. I feel like my whole life was a lie. Wow. It? Were the moments of happiness with Sarah not real? The question haunted him. May turned to June. The police found new evidence in Portland. Greg had been killed by someone connected to his old drug operation. Sarah was cleared of any involvement. But the damage was done. Joe filed for divorce. Sarah didn't contest anything. She signed away her rights to the house, the savings, everything. On a warm Tuesday in July, Joe joined a hiking group called Chicago Trailblazers. The meeting point was the nature center at North Park Village. The group leader was a woman named Emily. Athletic, with laughing eyes and an easy smile. First time with us? She asked, checking his name off the list. Yeah. Needed something new. Well, you picked a good day. We're doing the river trail. The hike was challenging, but beautiful. Emily kept the group entertained with facts about local wildlife. Joe found himself smiling for the first time in months. After the hike, Emily approached him. "You did well for a first-timer." "Thanks. I needed this more than I realized." "We meet every Tuesday and Saturday. Hope we'll see you again." He came back the next Saturday, and the Saturday after that. Emily was always there, with her knowledge of trails and her infectious enthusiasm. One day, over coffee at the Nature Center's cafe, she told him about her brother. "He died by suicide 3 years ago. I'm so sorry. It changed everything. Made me realize life's too short not to follow your heart." Joe found himself telling her about Sarah, about the affair, the secrets, all of it. Emily listened without judgment. "Sounds like you've been on quite a journey." "Yeah, still not sure where it ends." "Maybe it doesn't have to end," she said softly. "Maybe it's just changing direction." The Chicago summer bloomed around them. Joe and Emily started hiking together outside of group meetups. Starved Rock State Park became their favorite destination. She taught him rock climbing. He introduced her to his favorite blues clubs. In August, Sarah called. She was moving to Portland. "Not to go back to my old life," she explained, "but to finally face it, make peace with it." "I hope you find what you're looking for," Joe said, and meant it. That evening, he and Emily watched the sunset from Promontory Point. The lake stretched out before them, endless and blue. "You okay?" she asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "Yeah, I think I finally am." She took his hand, and he squeezed it gently. The past was behind him. The future, like the trail ahead, was full of possibility. Later that night, walking Emily to her car, he kissed her. It felt like waking up, like the start of something real and true. The Chicago skyline glittered around them, a city of second chances. And Joe Thompson, who had lost everything he thought he wanted, found everything he didn't know he needed.